There is a man on a ship. He is wealthy, he is famous, his writing is celebrated across the country by people who once wouldn't have let him in through the front door. The woman he spent years trying to become worthy of has come back, standing in his doorway with everything he once begged the world to give him. He has, by every measure anyone would apply, won. He finds a porthole, and he swims down until his lungs give out. Why? That question is the whole book, and I am going to tell you right now, the answer Jack London gives is not the one the self-improvement industry wants you to hear. Because Martin Eden, published in 1909, is not an inspiration story. London himself said so, with increasing desperation, for the rest of his life. He called it a warning, a cold, specific, carefully constructed warning about what is actually waiting at the end of the Becoming project. Most people still read it as inspiration, which is, when you think about it, the most frightening possible response to a warning. Martin Eden is a sailor, young, strong, built by labor and open water, and a life with no softness in it. He gets invited to a respectable family's house through a chain of social accidents, the kind that reroute entire lives, and he walks into their parlor and sees Ruth Morse for the first time. Ruth is everything Martin is not. She is educated with the particular ease of someone who has always had access to education, who has never had to fight for a seat at any table because the table was set for her before she arrived. She uses words Martin doesn't recognize. She holds herself with a calm that comes not from discipline but from never having had a reason to be uncertain. She is, in Martin's immediate and overwhelming perception, made of finer material than anything he has encountered. He feels like a beast. That is the word London uses. Martin looks at his own hands in that parlor and feels the full, crushing weight of what he is compared to what she is. And in that moment, something ignites in him that will burn his entire life to the ground before it's finished. He decides to become worthy of her. Not to court her cleverly, not to charm her, to actually transform himself from the inside, to build the kind of man who deserves to be in the same room as Ruth Morse and not feel the gap like a physical wound. He is going to read what she reads, think what she thinks, speak the language she speaks, understand the world she moves through as naturally as he understands the sea. But here's the thing, that decision is built on a premise so deep and so foundational that Martin never questions it, not once in all the years of grinding work ahead. The premise is this: the person he currently is, the sailor with the rough hands and the haphazard reading and the working-class grammar, that person is insufficient. That person is a problem requiring a solution. The solution is someone else, someone better, someone worthy. Can you actually buy your way into a different soul? Can you sand down everything original about yourself and replace it with something more acceptable and arrive on the other side as something real? This is the question the book opens in its first chapter and never fully answers. Because the answer is complicated in ways that only become clear when it's too late to change the decision. The grinding begins. 19-hour days. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. London is precise about the schedule. Martin sleeps 4 hours and spends the remaining 20 with borrowed library books and a pen and paper, teaching himself grammar, science, philosophy, literature, simultaneously, obsessively, without any roadmap except his own hunger. He is physically hungry too. There are stretches where the food money runs out entirely. He pawns things. He writes stories and submits them to magazines and receives rejections that are sometimes just a printed slip of paper, no personal acknowledgement, just a form letter that says no, and he writes more stories and submits again. Something is happening. That part is true. A mind is developing in him that was always there in raw form but now is being shaped by everything he feeds it. He is getting better. The writing is improving, the thinking is deepening, the connections he can make across different fields of knowledge are becoming genuinely remarkable. He is gaining real understanding, not performed understanding, not borrowed opinions, but actual comprehension that comes from a mind wrestling honestly with difficult material. Partial answer. He is becoming something real. But here is the loop that I think is the most quietly devastating part of this whole story. The more Martin learns, the more alone he becomes. Not less alone. The knowledge does not build him a bridge to Ruth's world. What it does is burn the bridge back to his own. His family, his old friends from the docks, the people who made up the entire community of his previous life, they recede. He still loves them, but he can no longer fully inhabit their world. He thinks differently now. He notices different things. He cannot turn it off. And the world he is reaching toward has not yet opened its doors. He is in the gap, belonging to nothing, at home nowhere. Think about how terrifying that is. We are sold education and self-improvement as the path toward connection, toward finally being understood by the world. London is showing us the other outcome. The one where you improve yourself right out of your original belonging before you've arrived anywhere new, where the knowledge doesn't connect you. It just shows you, with increasing precision, how alone you actually are. He keeps going, because Ruth is there, and Ruth is still the destination. He finally gets in the room, the literary dinner parties, the intellectual gatherings, the people who discuss philosophy and art as casually as other people discuss the weather, who have strong opinions about things most people have never heard of, who carry themselves with the specific confidence of individuals who have been told their entire lives that their thoughts are worth having. Martin has imagined these people as gods, not metaphorically. He has genuinely, through all the grinding years, held them as the summit of what a human mind could achieve, the highest expression, the proof that the project is worth completing. Getting to their level, earning a seat at their table, this has been the goal underneath the goal, the real destination that Ruth was always pointing toward. He sits at their table. They are not gods. They are barely even thinking. What Martin finds, with a clarity that his actual self-education makes impossible to argue with, is that these people are performing intellectual life rather than living it. They know which opinions are acceptable and repeat them with confidence. They know which books signal sophistication and name them in conversation without having read them carefully. They move through ideas the way socialites move through a party, deploying the right gestures at the right moments, never actually stopping to follow a thought wherever it honestly goes, because honest thinking is dangerous and might produce unfashionable conclusions. Martin has spent years in the genuinely uncomfortable work of following ideas to their actual ends. He knows the difference between that and what he is watching. The difference is everything. The top is empty. And if the top is empty, then where was he climbing toward this whole time? This is the loop that sits at the center of the book like a stone. Because you cannot maintain the motivation for a project once you have seen clearly and without the possibility of unseen that the project has no real object. The destination was a performance, which means the entire journey was oriented toward nothing real. We've all been there, maybe not this dramatically, but the specific deflation of getting close enough to something you wanted to see it clearly and discovering it is smaller and shallower than it looked from the outside. That feeling is not unique to Martin Eden. It is, in fact, extremely common. We just don't talk about it because the story we are supposed to tell is about how getting there was worth it. If you're tired of chasing a version of success that you are no longer certain is real, and you want somewhere to put that exhaustion down without being handed a solution immediately, consider subscribing. Let's drop the mask together. Success arrives, suddenly, the way it often does after years of nothing, like a door opening without warning, after you've stopped expecting it to move. The work that was rejected for years is now everywhere. His name is recognized. The money is real money, not the careful rationing of the grinding years, but actual abundance. Literary society, which kept its door partially open when he was reaching for it, now swings it wide and welcomes him in as a prize. And Ruth comes back. Ruth, the original object of the entire project. She comes back with genuine feeling, or what presents as genuine feeling, and offers him everything. Martin Eden, the hungry sailor once mapped out in the dark as the destination, the relationship, the acceptance, the life he was building toward. He turns her away. Not from bitterness, or not only from bitterness, from something colder and more structural. He can see, with the same clarity that showed him the hollow intellectuals for what they were, what Ruth is actually in love with. She is in love with Martin Eden, the celebrated writer, the cultural object, the name in the papers, the successfully completed project. She is not in love with Martin, the specific, original, rough-handed person who existed before the project began. And Martin knows that the celebrated writer is not him. It is a construction, assembled over years from pieces of his original self, the acceptable pieces, the pieces that could be refined into something the world would recognize as valuable. Everything else, everything rough and instinctive and genuinely his, was the cost of construction, was what he paid to become the person Ruth is now standing in front of. Who betrayed Martin? This is the question that won't stay still. Ruth. Who needed the validated version before she could love him? The intellectual class, who were never what they appeared. The entire social mythology that told him elevation was real and worth paying anything to reach? Or Martin himself, for the decision made at 21 in a respectable parlor that the person he actually was needed replacement. For the decades spent in deliberate erasure, for mistaking the original self for a rough draft when it was, in fact, the only real draft there would ever be. The betrayal was the premise that he was insufficient as he was, that the living, feeling, instinctively brilliant sailor was a problem rather than a person. He boards a ship, one last voyage, and in the dark water somewhere between here and there, far from the parties and the praise and the woman who loves the ghost of him, he lets the project end. Jack London spent years insisting this book was not a celebration. He was right, but I want to be careful about what the warning actually is. It is not that ambition is dangerous, or that education is hollow, or that love is a trap. Those are the wrong readings. The warning is about the premise, the original, foundational, never-examined premise that Martin accepted in that parlor without knowing he was accepting anything. The premise that who he was at the start was a deficiency requiring correction, that somewhere ahead was a more worthy version of himself, and the real life would begin after he had become that version. That is the trap, not the ambition, the postponement, the treating of the present self as insufficient currency, as something to be improved before it can be spent on actual living. Think about where you are in your own version of this project. Not Martin's project necessarily, not the literary self-education, but the version you are running. The improvements, the credentials, the performances of having it together, the reaching towards some threshold after which you will have earned the right to exist without the low-level hum of not being enough yet, the deferred life, the one that starts after the becoming is finished. Here is what Martin found at the summit, which is the thing London was trying to tell us. The becoming is never finished. There is no moment of arrival where the world looks at you and says, "Now you are enough, now you can start." The summit is occupied by people performing the same project at a different altitude. The distance between you and worthy is not a fixed measurement that shrinks as you work. It moves. It is designed to move. The self you are building toward is made from the pieces of the self you are discarding. And the pieces being discarded are the only ones that were actually yours to begin with. The rough ones, the uncertain ones, the ones that felt things before knowing the correct words for them, that loved things before checking whether loving them was acceptable, that were alive in a full and unperformed way that the refined version is always slightly less capable of. Martin Eden was most alive in the before, in the grinding, hungry, rejected, completely genuine before. The famous Martin Eden, the one the world celebrated, was more impressive and less real. Less actually there. And he knew it. And that knowledge, combined with the hollow summit and the ghost love of a woman who wanted the construction, was the thing the porthole offered an exit from. You do not have to follow him there. But you do have to hear the thing he could not hear, which is this. The original self is not the problem. The rough edges are not the problem. The unfinished, unpolished, uncertain, genuinely feeling version of you that exists right now, before you have completed the project, before you have achieved the threshold, before you have become acceptable by whatever standard you are currently holding yourself to, that version is not a rough draft. That version is the actual thing. Stop the erasure. Not the growing, not the learning, not the genuine reaching toward understanding and connection, but the erasure. The part of the project where you trade yourself for a more acceptable version and call it improvement. The part where you defer the actual experience of being yourself to some later date when you are finally finished enough to deserve it. The life is not waiting for you at the summit. The life is here, in the present, unrefined, still becoming version of you that is reading this right now. You are not insufficient. You never were. You are allowed to be exactly where you are, exactly as you are, without needing to earn permission for it first. Just be. That was always enough. Martin Eden just never got to find out.